Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Being Untamed. Now, for a moment here, I'd like you to close your eyes. Really step into the unknown. Shed all beliefs and assumptions we have about the future, and bring to mind something that you truly value. Your health, your mental clarity, a relationship or partner, a stable society. What if you suddenly lost that? Okay, now open your eyes. In my last talk, I spoke about systems theory as a collective sense-making tool and how to interact with complicated and complex systems. Now, once we've figured out the structure of our project and our communication, how do we move forward in agreeing on what we value and therefore how to make collective decisions? I want to lay the foundation of what value is and why we need to question and redefine it today. Now, I want to put this into context. We are projected to plateau in world population, and with converging crises, we may even decline in world population. And this will happen within our lifetimes. The significance of this is unimaginable, as our entire economic system was designed for this exponentially increasing population we've seen. Now, I want you to have the most open-minded understanding of what value is here, because money is simply an information technology and a belief system. It is defined as a map to understand and predict our socioeconomic future, and to incentivize behavior towards this narrative we hold. We've had different socioeconomic maps of how value is defined through the agricultural and the industrial revolution. And even today, we're seeing a shift towards an attention economy. On this population graph, you can say that these economic maps are linear approximations to the slope. We see that the rate of change is even higher in the coming decades. It's not so much about whether or not we have the potential difference of between 2 billion people or not, it's about the rate of change. And don't misunderstand this argument for anything about overpopulation or claims about what population should be. I'm simply stating that regardless of what happens, there will be radical changes to our economic system. And this will happen within our lifetime, so we shouldn't be clinging on to anything from the current system. And this is particularly evident because our current system is a Ponzi scheme. And when we stop increasing in population, a Ponzi scheme fails. And that means that humanity needs to question and redefine what value means. And additionally, as a quick tangent here, there will be relatively more old people than young people, which is something we haven't seen before to this extent. So what is valuable to us? And what is the scope of possibility of value? The process of questioning what value means to us is more important than the definition we arrive at, as it brings us into contact with all forms of value, ones that are implicit or done without reward. Now, living in the question instead of arriving at an answer of value is critical, as any defined value of system will become obsolete in every decade or so in this changing time. So, as I was saying, we use agreed upon metrics of value as a sense-making tool for our socioeconomic situation. And when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a useful measure. This is known as Goodhart's law. Because when that measure of value becomes an end in itself, instead of a means of exchange, it becomes corrupted. The loopholes are quickly found, and therefore the system gets hacked and gamed. And therefore, it's no longer a measure for proper incentivization or predicting and understanding our socioeconomic situation, because now you've changed the system that you're in. We can see how counterintuitive the result of this is, where providing for others becomes creating dependency on your service, or the attention economy becomes the distraction economy, or higher prices intended to prevent consumption really just creates an incentive to extract the resource. Monetary value seems to be increasingly diverging from what society and the planet need to be incentivizing, and therefore it's losing its function as a metric. That somehow we have convinced ourselves as a species that we can measure the value of everything with a single metric, and believe that it's a good measure for what society needs. Now, there's so much that needs to be done in the world today that we should be incentivizing but aren't. These are now becoming vital things which provide our life support mechanisms and will be an immense cost, and therefore there's really no excuse not to give value to it. Okay, so wait a minute. I've said we need to redefine value, but I've also said how counterintuitive value metrics are. So we're in a predicament here. Do we measure or do we not measure? Well, of course, the ideal would be to have a value system mapped directly with all forms of value and approach a true cost economics, where creating social value is rewarded and negative externalities are accounted for. But we can barely define what value means generally, let alone measure it in any non-intrusive way. Explicitly creating new metrics to universally agree on is incredibly difficult, especially with rapidly changing circumstances and needs. Okay, so let's not measure anything. Let's live in a sharing economy or gift economy. Yeah, maybe. Maybe for certain things. But we can't naively pretend to not measure anything as we fall into the trap of over-attributing money or other pre-existing implicit value systems. We can easily be playing an unconscious game which gets hacked in any amount of unknown ways. And locally, we want a solid agreement on value for sense making, for decision making, and to create an equitable society. Now, of course, this is not a question of ideals, but a question of improvements and applicability. A partial solution to Goodhart's law is to move towards a multivariate value system. This value system should fail in different ways, such that the aggregate is more neutral. A current and simple example of this is in certain jobs where you can have an hourly or piece rate, which is per task accomplished. And therefore, to balance the pros and cons of each by combining the two, of half paid hourly and half paid by piece rate, the system is much more difficult to hack and game, and therefore often isn't worth the effort to find the loopholes. But going beyond this, we should recognize that time, information, material, and energy behave fundamentally different in the way they are created, shared, and discarded, and therefore shouldn't have the same value mechanisms. I think as a first step, using these distinctions and having them as non-transferable may be an appropriate response. But either way, moving towards a value mapped closer to our reality is a valid aim. But to never take it too seriously, which means to never take it as an end in itself. Creating wealth in this new situation humanity is entering into will take many implicit forms, as we don't have the mechanisms for understanding or measuring it. I'm not simply suggesting we use barter. Barter only ever existed amongst enemies, and sharing economies and gift economies were primary, even between tribes. Relationships were always the most tangible form of wealth and security, and they were built on generosity. We should see what value we can provide to the local community, recognize our technologically mediated abundance, and lead with a gift. The ancient world found it rude to immediately pay back a gift, as it meant you didn't want to maintain this relationship past the transaction. And ultimately, a value system isn't at the level of the economy. It's deeply rooted in culture and the relationships that the environment affords. Providing value through relationships and gifts and planting the seeds for the next generation to flourish is really builds the commons. The commons is a public good that no one owns but everyone relies on. And I think commons will become more common as we transition from one socioeconomic system to the next. Its integrity relies on trust, and trust is person to person, which is great for community, but doesn't scale. So how do we scale commons and provide the flexibility of value to a growing number of people through this time of transition? Now, one tool I'd like to introduce is Commons Stack. It uses token engineering with a foundation in systems theory to create circular, purpose-driven economies around various initiatives and community projects. It's essentially an open source DAO builder. Now, I introduced this because it's the most impressive DAO builder I've seen, one which can adapt and is rooted in many principles to avoid failure points and have polar processing and build our economic system with biomimicry in mind. They have various open source tools to raise and allocate funding, to make decisions and measure impact for your unique applications. So far, in our economic mindset, we assume things scale linearly or exponentially, which leads to catastrophic outcomes, absurd inequalities, and entirely unreasonable predictions. But nature doesn't scale like that. Now, all the things I've talked about before in my talk about systems theory or how things scale, how things change over time, these can all be uniquely controlled in creating your own value system, so that someone who has 1,000 times the shares doesn't have 1,000 times the voting power, for example. Now, we need to question how wealth scales, how voting and democracy scales. And as things like open source projects, intentional communities, or any other use case for DAO really start to emerge, as we're seeing today, we really have the possibility to create new value systems. And these experiments are foundational in the time of transition here. It's one step towards a multivariable value system, one step towards a resource-based economy. And if we can define them with wisdom and all the knowledge from the leading edge science we have, maybe they can be adaptive in value and they won't lead to these exponential feedback loops that make our socioeconomic system further disconnected from the reality of things. And as I mentioned, the importance of being sensitive to context in my systems theory talk, it's important to recognize that economic systems can't be injected upon different cultures and expected to work the same. See, each bioregion and historical cultural community will inevitably have its own value system, whether we believe it or not. See, having one socioeconomic system try to spread itself through the entire population is a definition of fragility, as when one aspect of it fails, which it inevitably will, then we face an existential threat. This is basic evolutionary theory. And furthermore, each bioregion will value things differently because some areas will have droughts, others will have flooding, and the value systems and needs are entirely different for those groups. Being context sensitive and adaptive in our understanding of value is vital in this time. Of course, agreeing on value is important for sense making, trust, and collaboration, but let's not mistake the map for the territory when it comes to value. If we are convinced of the map, then not only are we feeding an outdated game with our attention, but we are forfeiting our control to ones who've already hacked this game. Thank you for your time and attention. I'll be definitely diving a lot more into these topics in future videos. And I'd just like to leave you with a few questions here. What does a value system that values future and future generations really look like? And how can we have a value system that embodies a growing circle of empathy beyond our needs and towards the needs for deep interdependent ecology?